At 22, Ilara had already lost her father, her home, and her trust in the very idea of family. All her brothers left her was the boarded-up shell of their father's corner bakery, a building the town called a blight and the pigeons called a palace, sold to her for the insulting sum of one single dollar bill and the thin, satisfied smile of the probate lawyer. Her brothers, Mark and Leo, they laughed. They actually laughed when she signed the paper, the sound of it brittle and wrong in the wood-paneled office. But what nobody knew, what the laughing brothers and the smirking lawyer and the pitying town could not possibly comprehend, was that the bakery wasn't just a building. It was a vault, a testament, a promise made of brick and flour and time. That, though, comes later. First, there was the cold. It was a November chill that had settled deep in her bones the day they lowered her father into the ground and had simply refused to leave.
Arthur had been a quiet man, a man whose hands always smelled of yeast and cinnamon, a man whose love was measured not in words, but in the perfect crust of a sourdough loaf, in the extra pastry slipped into a customer's bag on a hard day. He was the sun in her small sky, and when he went out, the world went gray and silent. The silence was the worst part. The silence where the gentle thud of dough on the floured board should have been. The silence in the small house behind the bakery where his heavy tread on the stairs was no longer heard. His death was sudden, a heart that had been too big for the world simply giving out one Tuesday morning, leaving behind the scent of a cooling rack of rye and a daughter who didn't know how to exist in a world without him. Her brothers arrived 2 days later, not for the grief, but for the accounting. Mark, the eldest, with his sharp suit and his sharper eyes that appraised every piece of furniture, every worn rug, as if it were a line item on a spreadsheet, and Leo, the younger, softer one, who wrung his hands and looked at his shoes and followed Mark's lead like a dinghy tied to a battleship. They had never understood the bakery. To them, it was a failure, a dusty relic of a life their father could have escaped, but chose not to. They saw the worn floorboards, the peeling paint, the ancient colossal brick oven that dominated the back wall, and they saw only liabilities. They did not see the generations of hands that had polished the door handle smooth, the children who had pressed their noses to the glass, the quiet transactions of kindness that happened over the worn wooden counter. They saw a prime corner lot. They saw an inheritance to be liquidated. The meeting in the lawyer's office was a blur of legal jargon that felt like a series of small, sharp blows. The house, the savings, the life insurance, it was all divided, cashed out, consumed by Mark's ambition and Leo's weakness. Ilara sat numbly, the small, worn dough scraper of her father's clutched in her pocket, its smooth, cool steel the only real thing in the room. When it came to the bakery, Mark had scoffed. "It's a teardown," he'd said, waving a dismissive hand. "The city will condemn it within the year. It'll cost more to demolish than the land is worth." He'd already had an offer on the house, a quick cash sale that would scrub their father's memory from the street. Ilara didn't say anything. She just stared at the pen on the lawyer's desk. "She can have it," Mark had finally declared, a grand, magnanimous gesture that was really just a way of saddling her with a burden, a final, public humiliation. "We'll sell it to her. For $1. The lawyer, a man named Sterling who had the predatory stillness of a heron, drew up the paper. Leo had looked at her then, a flicker of something. Shame, maybe, or just the discomfort of a coward in his eyes. But he said nothing. He just watched her sign. So they took the house. They took the savings. They took the comfortable chair where her father used to read the paper. They took it all. And they left her with the ruin. She stood before it now, the single key cold in her palm, the $1 bill folded neatly in her pocket beside the dough scraper. The windows were layered with grime and plywood, the cheerful blue paint of the sign that had once read, "Arthur's Artisan Bread," now faded to a leprous gray, the letters peeling away like sunburnt skin. The wind whined around the corner, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust from the main road. The town saw a wreck. Her brothers saw a joke. But as Ilara stood there, shivering in the failing light, she smelled something else, faint and deep and impossibly persistent. Under the dust, under the decay, she could just barely smell it.
The smell of bread.
The lock was stiff, rusted from a decade of disuse and damp coastal air. Elara put her shoulder into the heavy oak door, and it groaned open with the sound of a coffin lid, releasing a sigh of air so old and still it felt like a solid thing against her face. The air was a thick, dead thing, layered with the ghosts of 1,000 baking days, the sweetness of long-gone sugar, and the sour tang of dead yeast, all buried under a decade of fine gray dust that coated every surface like a shroud. She stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her, plunging the space into a cathedral gloom, the only light coming from thin cracks in the boarded-up windows, slicing the darkness into dusty, golden bars. For a long moment, she just stood there, letting her eyes adjust, breathing in the history of the place. It was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was just bigger. The main room was dominated by the long wooden counter, its surface scarred with the marks of countless bread knives and the ghostly white rings of flour-dusted bags. Behind it, the shelves were empty, save for a few forgotten paper sacks and a single, overturned tin. But it was the back of the shop that held the heart of the place, the brick oven. It was a behemoth, a sleeping giant of faded red brick and blackened iron, its mouth a dark, yawning cave. Her father had called it the dragon. He'd fed it oak and apple wood, and in return it had given him the crusts that made old women weep and the crumb that held the perfect amount of butter. It was the center of his world, and therefore the center of hers. A soft thump from the corner made her jump. In the deepest shadow, 2 amber eyes blinked open. A low, gravelly thump of a tail against a pile of dusty flour sacks. "Flour," she whispered. The dog, an aging terrier mix with the muzzle gone completely white and one floppy ear, lifted his head. He'd been her father's shadow, a small, 4-legged creature made of devotion and scruffy fur. The vet had said he was too old to be moved after Arthur died, that the stress would be too much. The brothers had wanted to take him to the pound. Elara had refused, but in the chaos of losing the house, she'd been terrified he'd been taken anyway. But here he was, he had stayed. He struggled to his feet, his old joints stiff, and trotted over to her, not with the frantic energy of a young dog, but with the steady, solemn purpose of a guardian returning to his post. He pushed his cold nose into her hand and leaned his weight against her leg. She sank to her knees, burying her face in the dusty fur of his neck, and the cold, hard knot of grief she'd been carrying for weeks finally began to soften. She was not entirely alone. She spent the first day just exploring, reacquainting herself with the geography of her own past. The small storeroom with its lingering scent of spices, the tiny office with its slanted floor and a single, rickety chair, the steep, narrow stairs leading up to the small apartment where her father had lived and died. It was all there, but muted, covered in the same fine layer of neglect. It was a mausoleum. That evening, as the light failed completely and the cold began to seep through the floorboards, there was a tentative knock on the front door. Elara froze. Flower let out a low growl. The knock came again, firmer this time. She crept to the door, peering through a crack in the plywood. An old woman stood on the doorstep, holding a steaming bowl covered with a plate. Mrs. Gable. She ran the small, cluttered hardware store next door, a woman as old and seemingly permanent as the brick buildings themselves. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and intelligent. Elara opened the door a crack. "Child," Mrs. Gable said, her voice raspy but kind. She didn't ask questions, she didn't offer pity. She just pushed the bowl into Elara's hands. "It's lentil, you need to eat." The soup was hot and thick, and as Elara ate it, sitting on an overturned bucket with the old dog at her feet, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the food. It was the first act of uncomplicated kindness she'd received since her father died. She slept that night on a pile of old flour sacks, Flour curled against her back, his slow, steady breathing a comfort in the dark. She dreamed of her father, not of his death, but of his life. She dreamed of being a little girl,
standing on a stool, her hands plunged into a mountain of dough, while his large, warm hands guided hers. He was teaching her how to feel the dough, to know when it was ready not by a timer, but by the life in it. "Bread remembers the hands that shaped it, Ellie," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "You have to be kind to it. You have to be patient. It knows." She woke to the gray light of morning, the dream still clinging to her. The bakery was cold and silent, but it felt different. Less like a tomb, more like a promise. She looked at her own hands, pale and empty in the dawn. She had nothing. No money, no home, no plan. But she had the bakery, and she had her father's hands. She stood up, dusting the flour from her clothes. It was time to get to work. The first week was a battle against grime. Armed with a bucket, a stiff bristled brush, and a seemingly endless supply of hot water heated on a small camping stove Mrs. Gable had silently left on her doorstep, Ilara scrubbed. She scrubbed the floors, the walls, the long-suffering counter. She scraped years of grease from the shelves and washed the grime from the inside of the display case until the glass, miraculously intact, shone. With every stroke of the brush, it felt less like cleaning and more like an archaeological dig, uncovering the life that had been buried here. Underneath a thick layer of dust on the office desk, she found the faint indentations of her father's handwriting, the ghost of 1,000 shopping lists. Behind a fallen sack in the storeroom, she found a child's drawing of a stick-figure baker, labeled Dad, in her own clumsy 6-year-old script. The town watched her. They were a silent, curious chorus. People walking by would slow their pace, their heads turning to see the light in the dusty windows, the clouds of dust motes she beat from old rugs in the alleyway. Some shook their heads in pity. Some, she was sure, were placing bets on how long she would last. She heard their whispers carried on the wind. "Arthur's girl. Poor thing. What's she thinking? That place is a death trap." One afternoon, a sleek black car, the kind that looked alien and predatory on the quiet side street, pulled up to the curb. A man in a suit so sharp it looked like it could cut glass stepped out. He was tall, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't approach her, just stood on the opposite sidewalk, hands on his hips, surveying the bakery like a general sizing up a battlefield. He looked at the peeling paint, the crumbling mortar, the patched-up roof, and his smile widened. He got back in his car and drove away. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Her brother Mark's words echoed in her mind. A teardown. She knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut, that this was the man who wanted to tear it down. That night, exhausted and sore, she was cleaning the area around the great brick oven, the Dragon. Flower, who had been her constant companion, shadowing her every move, had settled in one spot and refused to move. He was curled up right against the base of the oven on the left side, an area that was grimy with soot and ancient spills. "Come on, old boy," she said, trying to nudge him with her foot. "I need to clean here." He opened one eye, gave a low grumble, and didn't budge. He laid his head back down on his paws, his body pressed firmly against the brick. It was odd. He was usually so obedient. She tried to sweep around him, and that's when she noticed it. The brickwork. Her father had been a baker, but he'd also been a meticulous craftsman. He believed in doing things the right way, whether it was a 72-hour fermentation for a baguette or repairing a leaky faucet. Every brick in the oven's facade was perfectly aligned, the mortar joints uniform and clean, except for here. In this one section, a patch of about 3 feet by 3 feet, the bricks were subtly different, a slightly darker red, a rougher texture. And the mortar was a different color, a pale gray against the oven's aged, soot-darkened cream. It was a patch. A clumsy patch, at that. It was the kind of work her father would never have done. Or, more accurately, it was the kind of work her father would never have left visible. She ran her hand over it. It was solid, immovable. But it was wrong. It was a note played out of tune in a symphony she knew by heart. She looked down at the dog, who was now watching her, his amber eyes intent. He let out a soft whine and pushed his nose against the strange patch of bricks. She remembered her father's voice, a memory so clear it was almost a sound in the silent room. Measure twice, cut once, Ellie. Pay attention to the details. The truth is always in the details. All week, she had been looking at the surface of things, the dirt, the decay. But this was different. This was structural. This was a secret. She forgot about cleaning. She sat on the floor, her back against the cool brick of the oven, and stared at the patch. Flower rested his heavy head on her lap, his gaze fixed on the same spot. The two of them, a silent vigil in the dusty dark, guarding a question that had just been asked. Why was this wall built wrong? And what was it hiding? The question of the wall became an obsession. It hummed beneath the surface of every other task, a low, persistent frequency that pulled at her attention. During the day, she continued her work of reclamation, prying the plywood from the front windows, letting in the pale, watery sunlight for the first time in a decade. The light changed everything. It made the space feel less like a crypt and more like a sleeping giant, dust motes dancing in the bright shafts like tiny, benevolent spirits. Mrs. Gable, seeing the open windows, appeared with a stepladder and a bucket of soapy water, and the two of them, the old woman and the young one, worked in a comfortable silence, washing the years away. But at night, when the city was quiet and the only sounds were the settling groans of the old building and the soft breathing of the dog, Ilara would return to the oven. She ran her fingers over the mismatched mortar, tapping each brick, listening. Most gave a dull, solid thud. But one, near the bottom, right where Flower always laid his head, sounded different. It was a hollower sound, a note of emptiness where there should have been solid mass. She tried to pry at it with her fingernails, then with the edge of her father's dough scraper. The mortar was old, but it was stubborn. It held firm, a silent guardian of whatever lay behind. For 3 nights she worked at it, chipping away with the corner of the scraper, the small, repetitive sounds loud in the stillness. Flower lay nearby, a watchful presence, occasionally letting out a low whine of encouragement. It was painstaking work. The mortar crumbled away in tiny grains, dusting her hands and the floor with pale gray powder. It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. On the 4th night, she was tired. Her muscles ached, her fingers were raw, and a wave of despair washed over her. What was she even doing? She was alone in a derelict building, fighting with a wall, chasing a ghost. Her brothers were probably sitting in a warm, clean apartment, counting their money, laughing at her. The sleek black car had driven by again that afternoon, slower this time, the man with the silver hair staring not at the building, but directly at her as she stood on the sidewalk, shaking out a dusty rug. His smile had been a predatory thing, a promise of trouble. The weight of it all pressed down on her. She slumped against the oven, the dough scraper falling from her numb fingers and clattering on the floor. She was going to fail. She was going to end up on the street, and the man with the silver hair would get his way, and the dragon would be reduced to a pile of rubble, and her father's memory would be bulldozed into nothing. Flower got up, nudged the fallen scraper with his nose, and then pushed his head hard into her hand, looking up at her with an expression of such profound, unwavering faith that it broke her heart. He believed in her. This dusty, loyal, arthritic old dog believed in her more than she believed in herself. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and brick and dog. She would not give up, not yet. She picked up the scraper. It felt different in her hand now, not just a tool, but a legacy. She wedged the corner into the groove she had painstakingly carved. She put her weight into it, leaning, twisting, a silent prayer on her lips. There was a grating sound, a scraping of brick against brick. And then, a small miracle. The brick shifted. It moved, just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. Hope, fierce and sudden, surged through her. She worked the scraper around the edges, her heart hammering against her ribs. With a final, groaning protest, the brick came loose in her hand.
She pulled it out and peered into the darkness behind it. A wave of cool, dry air, completely different from the bakery's damp atmosphere, washed over her face. It smelled of old paper, of leather, and of time itself. Her hands trembling, she reached for the next brick, and then the next. They came away easily now, the mortar around them little more than sand. It was a false wall, just one brick deep. Behind it was a cavity, a dark, hollow space built into the massive foundation of the oven. After she'd removed a dozen bricks, the opening was large enough to see into. She retrieved the small camping lantern Mrs. Gable had given her and shone its beam into the hole. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't gold or jewels or stacks of cash. It was something far stranger, far more precious. Lined up on rough-hewn wooden shelves, filling the hidden chamber from top to bottom, were books. Dozens and dozens of them. Not printed books, but ledgers. Simple, black-bound accounting ledgers, each one tied neatly with twine, a small paper tag on its spine with a year written in her father's familiar, precise script. 1985, 1986, 1987. They went all the way up to the year he had closed the bakery. And there, sitting on the top of the very first stack, was a small, locked tin box, the kind people used for petty cash. A deep, primal curiosity, stronger than her exhaustion, stronger than her fear, took hold. She reached into the darkness, her fingers closing around the cool, smooth spine of the ledger for the final year the bakery was open. She pulled it out, the weight of it solid and real in her hands. What was waiting inside this book, inside this wall, was something nobody expected. She carried the ledger to the small office, the one with the slanted floor and the single wooden chair. She set the camping lantern on the dusty desk, its circle of light pushing back the shadows, creating an island of discovery in the sea of darkness. Flower padded in after her, settling at her feet with a contented sigh, as if his long watch was finally over. For a moment, Ilara just looked at the book. It was a standard accountant's ledger, its black cover worn smooth at the corners. The tag on the spine read simply 2008, the year everything had stopped. The year her father's knees had finally given out, the doctor telling him the long hours standing on hard floors had to end. He'd closed the bakery, sold off the equipment, and retired to the small house out back, a man suddenly without a purpose. Or so she had thought. Her hands were trembling as she untied the rough twine and opened the cover. The first page was not what she expected. It wasn't a list of assets or sales. The heading, in her father's neat, blocky handwriting, read, DBBTS. Her heart sank. Had he been in trouble? Was this a record of his financial ruin, the secret shame that had kept him in this dusty building? She scanned the page. The first entry was dated January 12, 2008. In the first column, a name, Gable, M. Mrs. Gable. Next to it, an entry, Final mortgage payment, First National Bank. And in the final column, two words that made the breath catch in her throat. Paid in full. She stared at the words, her mind struggling to connect them. Mrs. Gable had told her once, years ago, that she'd almost lost the hardware store after her husband died, that a miracle had happened at the last minute. Ilara had assumed it was a turn of phrase. She turned the page. Another name. Rodriguez, E. Mr. Rodriguez, the quiet man who ran the corner grocery. The entry. Tuition, spring semester, State University. For Sophia, his daughter. And again, those two beautiful, impossible words. Paid in full. Page after page, it was the same. A name from the neighborhood, a crisis averted, a debt erased. Dr. Evans's medical school loans, a staggering sum, paid off over 5 years. The Miller family's hospital bills after their son's accident. The down payment for the new furnace at the community church. the seed money for the flower shop that had closed a few years back. It wasn't a record of debts he owed. It was a record of debts he had paid. On behalf of everyone. He hadn't just been baking bread. He had been shouldering the burdens of an entire community, in secret, for decades. Each entry was a quiet act of anonymous grace. He wasn't just Arthur the baker. He was a silent guardian, a one-man bank of kindness, his only currency compassion, his only return the continued existence of the small, fragile ecosystem of his neighborhood.
The scale of it was dizzying. She stumbled back to the oven, to the hole in the wall, and began pulling out more ledgers. 1995. 1985. The names were different, but the story was the same. A world of secret struggles and silent rescues, all meticulously recorded in her father's hand. He had used the profits from his simple bakery, a place his sons had dismissed as a failure, to keep his world afloat. He hadn't been poor because he was a bad businessman. He had been poor because he had given everything away. The laughter of her brothers in the lawyer's office echoed in her ears, but now it sounded hollow, pathetic. They had been laughing at a king, thinking he was a pauper. They had stripped his kingdom for parts, blind to the fact that the real treasure was never in the house or the savings account. It was here, in these books, in the quiet dignity of 1,000 good deeds. She sat on the floor amidst the ledgers, the dust, the silence. The scale of his goodness was a physical weight. It was overwhelming. He had left her this. Not the money, not the property. He had left her the truth. He had trusted that she, the daughter who had loved the bakery, the one who had stayed, would be the one to find it. He had left her the key, not just to the building, but to his very soul. If you have stayed with this story this far, if you have sat here in the dark with Alara and the ghost of her father, then stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the part where the world that has been sleeping finally begins to wake up. It is the part where a debt is not just a number in a book, but a promise that is finally kept. The story of Arthur the baker was not over. It was just beginning. The next few days passed in a dream. Alara moved between two worlds. By day, she was a ghost in her father's life, poring over the ledgers, tracing the complex, invisible web of kindness he had woven through the town for over 30 years. She learned the secret histories of her neighbors, the quiet desperations and the miraculous reprieves. She saw the patterns, the way he would pay a family's heating bill one winter, and then 5 years later, the tuition for that family's child. It was a long, patient, generational investment in people. By night, she returned to the physical world, her purpose renewed, her movements now filled with a fierce, quiet energy. The cleaning was no longer a chore, it was a consecration. She wasn't just scrubbing floors, she was preparing a sanctuary. She found the old canvas-proofing cloths, washed them until they were soft and white, and hung them in the sunlit windows to dry, like prayer flags. She polished the brass handle on the front door until it gleamed. The bakery began to feel less like a ruin and more like a ship, waiting for its captain. The man with the silver hair came back. This time, he didn't stay in his car. He walked right up to the front door, which Alara had propped open to air out the building. He was even more polished up close, his shoes reflecting the sky, a faint, expensive scent of cologne preceding him. "Miss," he began, his voice smooth as cream. "My name is Sterling, Marcus Sterling." He extended a hand. Alara looked at it, then back at his face, and did not take it. She just wiped her own dusty hand on her jeans. His smile tightened a fraction. "I'm a developer," he said, as if that explained everything. "I've been admiring this property for some time. It has potential." He gestured vaguely at the street. "This whole block, really. It's underutilized. I have a vision for it, something new, something profitable." Alara remained silent, letting the word profitable hang in the air between them. It sounded obscene in this place. "I understand this property is now yours," Sterling continued, his eyes flicking around the clean but empty interior, dismissing it.
And I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer, enough to get you out of this situation. A fresh start, a new life somewhere else. He named a number. It was a large number, more money than Alara had ever seen or imagined holding. It was enough to buy a small house, a car, to never worry about money again. It was the kind of number her brothers would have jumped at. A year ago, she might have too. But now, sitting on the desk in the back office, was a ledger that held the true accounting. No, she said. The word was quiet, but absolute. Sterling blinked, surprised. He was not used to being told no. I think you misunderstand, miss. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. It's not for sale, Alara said, her voice a little stronger this time.
Sterling's smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of paternalistic condescension. Let's be sensible, he said, his tone shifting. This building is a wreck. It's functionally worthless. The offer I'm making is charity, frankly, and I should also mention, I've already taken the liberty of filing a preliminary application with the city for a demolition permit. The structure is unsafe. It's a danger to the public. It's only a matter of time before they condemn it. My offer is your only way of walking away from this with anything at all. It was a threat wrapped in a business proposal. Sell or I will take it for nothing. He thought he was holding all the cards. He saw a young, broke, grieving girl. He didn't see the daughter of the man who had stared down bankers and hospitals and won. The building is not unsafe, Alara said, her voice steady. And it's not for sale. She turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing on the sidewalk. She could feel his eyes on her back, hot with frustration and disbelief. The encounter left her shaken, but also strangely energized. The lines were drawn. The fight was no longer a vague fear. It had a name and a face. Marcus Sterling. Later that day, another visitor appeared. It was her brother, Leo. He looked even more haggard than he had in the lawyer's office, his clothes rumpled, dark circles under his eyes. Alara, he said, his voice low, avoiding her gaze. I heard you were here. I'm here, she said. Mark is furious, he said, wringing his hands. He heard you turn down an offer. A big one. From Sterling. How would he know that? Sterling called him. They've been talking for months. Sterling was the one who was going to buy the lot after the demolition. The betrayal was so simple, so transactional, it almost took her breath away. They hadn't just abandoned her. They had conspired against her. Leo, what did you think was going to happen? She asked, her voice flat. I don't know, he mumbled, finally looking at her, his eyes full of a miserable, weak shame. Mark said it was for the best. He said Dad held on to this place for too long, that it was a weight on him. He said selling it all was like setting him free. Setting him free? The words came out sharper than she intended. Did you ever once ask Dad what he wanted? Did you ever spend one single day in this bakery, learning what he did, who he was? He was just a baker, Leo said, his voice rising in desperation. He made bread, Alara. And he ended up with nothing. He ended up with everything, she said, the truth of it ringing in the dusty air. You just weren't smart enough to see it. She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal more final than any argument. Please, Ellie, he begged, his voice cracking. Just take the money, sell the place, before Sterling tears it down anyway, for your own good. My own good, she repeated softly. She thought of the names in the books. Mrs. Gable, the Rodriguezes, the Millers. Her father had spent a lifetime looking out for other people's good. You should go, Leo, she said without turning around. He stood there for a long moment, and then she heard his footsteps retreating, the sound of a man walking away from his last chance. That night, the weight of the coming fight settled on her. Sterling was a shark who smelled blood, and her brothers were circling with him. She was alone, with no resources beyond her own two hands and a building the world had already condemned. The ledgers were a moral shield, but she needed a sword.
She needed a sign. She remembered the small, locked tin box she'd found on top of the ledgers. In the chaos of the discovery, she had set it aside and forgotten about it.
Now she retrieved it from the office. It was a simple cash box, gray and utilitarian, with a small, cheap lock. The key was nowhere to be found. But Mrs. Gable, in her infinite wisdom, had also left a small toolbox on the doorstep, which included a hammer and a sturdy screwdriver. It took only a few sharp raps to break the old lock. The lid sprang open with a faint metallic sigh. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded red velvet, were two things. The first was her father's primary dough scraper. She recognized it instantly. It was older and more worn than the one he'd given her, the wooden handle darkened with the oil of his hand, the steel blade worn into a gentle curve from decades of scraping against his favorite maple bench. One corner of the blade was chipped, a small, familiar imperfection. This was his Excalibur, the tool that had been an extension of his own hands. It was the heart of his craft.
Beneath it was a single, thick envelope, sealed with a blob of red wax, the kind used for fancy invitations. On the front, in his unmistakable script, was one word: Ellie. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It was a letter from the dead, a message in a bottle sent across the silent ocean of time. She broke the seal carefully, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She unfolded the single, yellowed page. The letter was not long. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means you found my library. It means the old dog led you to the right spot, and you were stubborn enough to listen. I knew you would be. Of all of us, you were the only one who ever truly understood the heart of this place. You have probably seen the books. You probably have a lot of questions. It's simple, really. I called it the Bank of Kindness. A town is not just a collection of buildings, Ellie. It's a network of people. And sometimes, that network gets frayed. People fall on hard times.
They get sick, they lose a job, they get a bad break. A little bit of help at the right moment can be the difference between a thread snapping and a thread holding. I was never a rich man, but the bakery was good to me. It gave me more than I needed. So, I just reinvested. I paid off a loan here, covered a bill there. I didn't want thanks. I didn't want a plaque. I just wanted the town to hold. I wanted Mrs. Gable to keep her store. I wanted Sofia Rodriguez to go to college. It was my secret project, my real artisan craft. Your brothers, they are good boys, but they see the world in dollars and cents. They would not understand this. They see this bakery as a failure because it didn't make me wealthy. They don't see that it made the whole neighborhood richer. I am leaving this choice to you. The ledgers are a record, but the work is in the future, not the past. This building, this oven, they are the last payment. A gift, free and clear. You can sell it, take the money, and build a new life. There is no shame in that. You owe these people nothing. My debts are not your debts. Or, you can stay. You can fire up the old dragon. You can make bread. Remember what I taught you. Bread remembers the hands that shaped it. Be kind. Be patient. The world needs bread, Ellie. Not just the kind that fills the belly, but the kind that feeds the soul. Whatever you choose, know that I am proud of you. Know that I have always been proud of you. Love, Dad. She read the letter twice, then a third time, the words blurring through a film of tears. The tears weren't for his death, but for the beauty of his life. He had seen her. He had known her, better than she had known herself. He hadn't burdened her with an obligation. He had given her a choice, a blessing. He had passed the torch, but given her permission not to carry it. And in doing so, he guaranteed that she would. She stood up and walked to the front of the bakery, the letter clutched in one hand, the old dough scraper in the other. Through the newly cleaned glass, she could see the streetlights coming on, casting a warm, golden glow on the pavement. She saw Mrs. Gable turn the sign on her own shop door to closed. She saw the lights go on in the apartments above the stores. A network of people, her father's town.
Sterling's threat, Leo's pleading, her brother's greed, it all seemed small and distant now. She had the ledgers, she had the letter, she had the truth. And tomorrow, there was a town meeting. A public hearing for the demolition of 112 Miller Street, her father's bakery. She looked down at the worn dough scraper in her hand. "Okay, Dad," she whispered to the empty, quiet room. "Let's make some bread." The town hall meeting room was depressingly beige, smelling faintly of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, unflattering glare on the 24 or so people scattered in the plastic chairs. Most were there out of a sense of civic duty or sheer boredom. At the front of the room, a long table was occupied by the town council, a collection of tired-looking men and women, led by Mayor Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild indigestion. Marcus Sterling was already there, sitting in the front row with a younger man in a similar suit, who was presumably his lawyer. They were whispering together, spreading blueprints across their laps. Sterling looked confident, relaxed, a predator who knew the hunt was already over. Ilara's brother Mark was there too, sitting a few rows behind Sterling, trying to look casual, but the smug, anticipatory gleam in his eye gave him away. He caught Ilara's eye as she entered and gave a small, condescending nod, as if to say, "See, this is how the world works." Ilara took a seat in the back, a simple cloth bag resting on her lap. She felt small and out of place. Mrs. Gable, who had closed her shop early, came in and sat beside her, placing a gnarled, reassuring hand on her arm. "You just tell the truth, child," she whispered. "The truth has a weight all its own." The meeting began. After a few tedious items of business, Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. Next on the agenda is the application for a demolition permit for the property at 112 Miller Street, the old corner bakery. He looked out over the sparse crowd. "Mr. Sterling, I believe you wanted to speak to this." Sterling rose, his movements smooth and practiced. He walked to the podium, giving a warm, professional smile to the council. "Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. My name is Marcus Sterling, and I am the principal of Sterling Development. We are here tonight because we see an opportunity to take a piece of blighted, unsafe property and transform it into something that benefits the entire community." He unfurled a large, glossy architectural rendering. It showed a modern, glass and steel condominium building with a generic-looking coffee shop on the ground floor. "The corner lofts," he announced. "Luxury living, new commercial tax revenue, construction jobs. A shot in the arm for this town." He then launched into a detailed, jargon-filled presentation about structural deficiencies, citing a report he had commissioned. He used words like non-viable, public hazard, and irreversible decay. He painted a picture of a building so dangerous it was a miracle it was still standing. He made it sound like he was doing the town a favor by tearing it down. When he finished, he looked directly at Ilara. "I know there is some sentiment attached to the old place. But sentiment doesn't pay for a new roof. Sentiment doesn't fix a crumbling foundation. Sometimes we have to be practical. We have to choose the future over the past." The council members nodded sagely. Mark looked like he was about to applaud. The mayor looked at his papers. "Does anyone wish to speak in opposition to the permit?" The room was silent. Ilara's heart hammered. This was it. She stood up. Her legs felt weak. Every eye in the room turned to her. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the words out. "My name is Ilara. That bakery was my father's." Sterling gave her a look of practiced pity. "Young lady, we all appreciate your connection to the building, but as I said—" "My father was Arthur," she said, cutting him off, her voice gaining strength. "He was a baker. And you're right, Mr. Sterling. The building is not about sentiment. It's about practicality. She walked to the podium, placing the cloth bag on its surface. She looked not at Sterling, but at the faces in the room. She saw Mr. Rodriguez from the grocery and Mrs. Chen, who had run the flower shop. She saw the fire chief and one of the local police officers. She saw Mayor Thompson. She reached into the bag and pulled out a ledger, the 2008 book. "My father was a very practical man," she said, opening it. "He kept very detailed records." She ran her finger down the first page. January 12, 2008. A final mortgage payment to First National Bank. For the property at 114 Miller Street, the hardware store. She looked at Mrs. Gable, who was now weeping silently. "It says here, paid in full." A murmur went through the room. She turned the page. March 2, 2008. Tuition for 1 semester at State University for Sofia Rodriguez. She looked at Mr. Rodriguez, whose mouth was hanging open. Paid in full. She kept going. She didn't raise her voice. She just read the names, the dates, the deeds. She read about the hospital bill for the fire chief's wife after her long illness. She read about the loan to the police officer's father to keep his farm from going under 20 years ago. She pulled out another ledger, and then another. The names went on. A tapestry of quiet desperation and silent salvation. The room had gone from sleepy and bored to utterly, raptly silent. People were looking at each other, stunned. They were looking at their neighbors in a new light, seeing the hidden histories that connected them all. Mark's smug expression had melted away, replaced by a pale, sick confusion. Sterling looked furious, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling into dust. Finally, Ilara stopped. She looked up at the man at the head of the table. "Mayor Thompson," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I have a ledger here from 1982. It's about a small loan to help a young man start a business after his own father's company went bankrupt. A hardware store that didn't make it." The mayor's face had gone white. "The name on the entry is Thompson, your father." Ilara closed the book. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavier than brick, more powerful than any blueprint. It was the truth. "My father believed a town was a network of people," she said softly. "He spent his life making sure the threads held. This bakery is not a blight. It's the heart of this town, and it is not for sale." The mayor stared at Ilara, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. The slick developer, the greedy brother, the sleepy town council, they all faded into the background. The room, which had been a stage for a real estate transaction, had become a hall of records, a place of public confession. The truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. It settled over the room, rearranging the past and therefore the future. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He looked down at his hands, then at Sterling, then at Ilara. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Ilara couldn't quite name. "Your presentation was compelling, but I believe new information has come to light." Sterling stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is a farce. This is irrelevant hearsay. We are here to discuss a matter of public safety, not some sentimental fantasy about a long-dead baker." "Was it a fantasy, Mr. Rodriguez?" the mayor asked, his gaze shifting to the grocer, who was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head, unable to speak. "Was it a fantasy, Chief Miller?" The fire chief, a big, stoic man, just stared at Ilara with a look of profound, dawning gratitude. "No, sir," he said, his voice cracking. "It was not." The community chorus had found its voice. One by one, the people Arthur had helped, or their children, began to understand the quiet miracles that had shaped their lives. The threads of the network were becoming visible, glowing in the harsh fluorescent light. Mark, her brother, looked horrified. He was a man who understood numbers, and a terrible, undeniable equation was forming in his mind. He was seeing the life his father had actually lived, the wealth he had actually accumulated, a wealth of loyalty, of love, of community. and was realizing that he had tried to sell it all for scrap. He looked at Ilara, not with condescension now, but with a kind of terrified awe. He stood up abruptly and stumbled out of the room, unable to bear the weight of the truth. Sterling, seeing his support evaporate, made one last, desperate play. "This changes nothing. The building is still a ruin. The law is the law. You must approve this permit. But the law is a brittle thing when it goes against the will of a people who have just rediscovered their own heart." The mayor looked at the council members, who were all looking back at him, their faces clear. "I believe," the mayor said slowly, "that this permit application requires further review. A historical impact study, perhaps. A structural reassessment by a neutral party. A very, very long review." He brought his gavel down with a soft, final thud. "Application denied. Next item." Sterling stood frozen for a second, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then he swept his blueprints off the table in a furious gesture and stormed out, his lawyer trailing in his wake. The meeting was over. People began to cluster around Ilara, not crowding her, but forming a protective circle. They didn't say much. A hand on her shoulder, a whispered, "Thank you." Mr. Rodriguez pressed a bag of apples into her hands. Mrs. Chen promised her the first roses of spring. They were repaying the debt, not with money, but with the small, vital currency of community. As Ilara was packing the ledgers back into her bag, she saw a figure hesitating by the door. It was Leo. He hadn't run like Mark. He was just standing there, his face streaked with tears, looking utterly broken. She walked over to him. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice raw. "I swear to God, Ellie, I didn't know." "I know," she said, and she did. Mark's cruelty was active, a thing of ambition and greed. Leo's was passive, a thing of weakness and fear. It was not the same. "He thought we were ashamed of him," Leo choked out. "Mark always said he was just a baker. We were so stupid. We were so blind." He finally looked her in the eye, and the shame she saw there was deep and real. "What can I do?" he asked, the question a genuine plea. "How can I—" He couldn't finish. Ilara thought of her father's letter. "My debts are not your debts." Revenge was easy. Forgiveness was harder. But redemption? Redemption was work. "Come to the bakery tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock. Bring a hammer. The roof leaks." He stared at her, not understanding. "What?" "The roof leaks," she repeated. "And the floor in the storeroom needs to be replaced. And the plumbing in the apartment is shot. There's work to do." A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, appeared in his eyes. She wasn't offering him forgiveness, not yet. She was offering him a chance to earn it. She was offering him a way back. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I'll be there." She walked out of the town hall and into the cool night air. Mrs. Gable was waiting for her. She didn't say a word, just wrapped Ilara in a fierce, bony hug that smelled of sawdust and old iron. As they walked back down Miller Street toward the dark, quiet bakery, Ilara felt a shift in the world. The building was no longer a ruin, a burden. It was an anchor, a lighthouse, and for the first time since her father died, she felt like she was home. The next morning, at 5 minutes to 8, Leo was there. He stood on the sidewalk in front of the bakery, looking lost and uncertain. He was wearing jeans and an old sweatshirt, a stark contrast to the suit he'd worn to the lawyer's office. In his hand, he held a hammer. It looked new. He'd probably bought it from Mrs. Gable's. Ilara opened the door. The smell of old dust and new hope drifted out. "You're early," she said. "The roof isn't going to fix itself," he replied, his voice quiet. He stepped inside, looking around at the space he had dismissed so easily. Seen through the lens of the previous night's revelations, It looked different. He saw not decay, but potential. Not failure, but history. Ilara didn't coddle him. She didn't offer coffee or platitudes. She pointed. Up there. And so his penance began. It was hard, dirty work. They spent the first day just clearing debris from the flat roof, patching the worst of the leaks with tar and grit. Leo worked with a grim, silent determination, his soft office hands quickly becoming blistered and raw. He never complained. He just worked. By midday, they were no longer alone. The fire chief, off duty, showed up with a truck full of lumber. "Heard you were fixing the roof," he said, clapping Leo on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. "Figured you could use some proper joists." The old man wouldn't want his girl falling through the ceiling. Soon after, Mr. Rodriguez arrived with a cooler full of sandwiches and cold drinks. His daughter, Sophia, the college student, was with him. She was studying to be an architect. She looked at the building with a professional eye, tapping walls and making notes on a pad. "The bones are good," she announced. "Strong. My grandfather helped your grandfather build that oven. He said they built it to last forever." By the end of the week, the bakery had become a hive of activity. It was the strangest barn raising the town had ever seen. An electrician, whose father's gambling debts Arthur had quietly erased, showed up to rewire the entire building, declaring the old knob and tube a fire hazard. A plumber, whose wedding Arthur had catered for free when the young couple had nothing, spent a Saturday replacing the ancient pipes. The community, bound by the invisible threads of a dead man's kindness, was repaying the debt. They were not paying Ilara, they were paying Arthur. They were balancing a ledger that was 30 years overdue. Ilara directed the work with a quiet authority she didn't know she possessed. She knew what her father would have wanted, how he would have wanted it done. Measure twice, cut once. Use the right materials. Do it right or don't do it at all. In the evenings, after the volunteers had gone home, she and Leo would sit in the dusty main room, eating the food Mrs. Gable invariably left for them, too tired to speak. In that shared silence and exhaustion, something began to mend. The chasm of betrayal between them began to fill, not with words, but with the shared reality of sore muscles and the satisfaction of a solid day's work. One night, Leo finally spoke. "I talked to Mark," he said, staring into his cup of soup. "He doesn't get it. He's still angry. He says you cheated him out of his inheritance." Ilara said nothing. There was nothing to say. "He called Dad a fool. I told him he was the fool. I told him Dad was the richest man I'd ever known. He hung up on me." Leo looked up, his eyes clear for the first time in a long time. "Thank you, Ellie, for this." He gestured around the half-restored room. "For letting me help." Ilara just nodded. It was enough. As the building came back to life, so did she. The hollow space inside her, carved out by grief and betrayal, began to fill. She fired up the dragon. It took 2 days of feeding it small fires, slowly bringing the temperature up, drying out the old brick and mortar. On the 3rd day, she mixed her first batch of dough. She used her father's recipe, the one she knew by heart, the one that lived in her hands. As she worked the dough on the newly sanded maple bench, using her father's scraper, Flower the dog watching her every move, she felt him there with her. His presence was a warmth at her back, a quiet approval in the air. The first loaves she baked were not for sale. She gave one to every person who had helped. A loaf for the fire chief, for the plumber, for Mr. Rodriguez, a special cinnamon swirl loaf for Mrs. Gable. It was her way of saying thank you, her father's way. The bakery was not a business yet. It was still a construction site, a work in progress. But it was alive. It had a heartbeat again. The slow, steady rhythm of the oven, the murmur of voices, the scent of sawdust and fresh paint, and, finally, gloriously, the smell of baking bread. rolling out the open door and down Miller Street like a proclamation of hope. Spring came fully by mid-April, and with it, the grand reopening of Arthur's Artisan Bread. There was no ribbon cutting, no speech from the mayor. The only announcement was the scent of fresh baking, a warm, yeasty invitation that drifted through the neighborhood, more potent than any newspaper ad. Ilara simply unlocked the door at dawn, turned the sign Mrs. Gable had repainted for her, from closed to open, and went back to shaping boules. The people came. At first it was the helpers, the crew of volunteers who had rebuilt the place. They came not as customers, but as proud shareholders, wanting to see the finished product of their labor. Then came the curious, drawn by the smell and the story that had now become a local legend. They bought bread and pastries and coffee, but they were also buying a piece of the story, a connection to the town's rediscovered soul. The bakery was transformed. The floors shone, the glass gleamed, and the long wooden counter was laden with the fruits of the dragon's fire. Crusty sourdoughs, dark pumpernickels, glossy challas, and glistening morning buns. In a frame on the wall behind the counter, she had put her father's letter. Next to it hung his old, chipped dough scraper. The one she used now was a new copy, identical but for the patina of age. Leo was there. He worked the counter, his old life as a junior executive shed like a snake's skin. He was clumsy with the cash register at first, and his bags were never as neat as Ilara's, but he smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He talked to the customers, learning their names, their stories. He was a different man, lighter, happier. He was earning his redemption, one paper bag at a time. The business was good. More than good, it was blessed. But Ilara never forgot the ledgers, which she kept safely in the little office. She never forgot the principle they represented. The bakery was a business, but it was also a ministry. One afternoon, a young woman came in, a baby on her hip and two other small children clinging to her coat. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with worry. She looked at the prices on the chalkboard menu, her face falling as she did the silent, painful math of a person with too little money and too much month. She herded her children toward the door, promising them a treat some other day. Ilara watched her go. She saw the ghost of a dozen entries in her father's books, a grocery bill paid, a rent check covered, a thread about to snap. She scooped a handful of warm chocolate chip cookies into a bag, grabbed the largest, softest loaf of challah from the rack, and walked out the door after the woman. "Ma'am," she called out. The woman turned, her expression wary, expecting a scolding for her children's sticky fingerprints on the glass. Ilara held out the bag. "You forgot this," she said simply. The woman stared at the bag, then at Ilara, confused. I didn't buy anything." "I know," Ilara said, pressing the warm loaf and the cookie bag into the woman's hands. "It's a new recipe. I need someone to test it for me. Tell me if it's any good." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She understood the gesture for the gift it was, a moment of grace that preserved her dignity. She tried to stammer her thanks, but Ilara just smiled. "Enjoy it," she said, and went back inside. From behind the counter, Leo had watched the whole exchange. He said nothing, but his eyes shone with a deep, quiet pride. The bell on the door jingled, and a new customer entered, a stranger, a tourist perhaps, looking for a coffee. As Ilara turned to greet them, her hands white with flour, the afternoon sun streamed through the clean front window, illuminating the swirling dust motes, turning them from reminders of decay into particles of golden light. She had lost everything, and in doing so, had found the one thing that mattered. She had taken a ruin and built a home. She had taken her father's grief and transformed it into purpose. The legacy was not in the ledgers, not in the building, not even in the bread. The legacy was in the act of giving. It was alive, and it was being passed forward. Bread, she thought, as her hands went back to the familiar, life-giving work of shaping the dough, really does remember the hands that shaped it.
Like, do we need any of these? I don't think so. I think we're good. At least for now, anyway. Okay. Oh my god, we got another slate piece. Man, we're like killing it today. We get more pathing. Actually, I think we do have pathing back at the base. Shield fossil tail. Do we have that already? I think we do. Yeah, no, we're good on the shield fossil. We just need something for the sail fossil, I think. Okay, make a little picnic set over here. I'm like trying to keep my eye out for any Pokemon that have spawned. I don't see anything yet, which I feel like is both good and bad. Wait, Ezzy, why are you surprised? Tall. I feel like that's pretty short. I'm short, okay, I figured people are blessed. I'm dying. Okay, what letters on the back here? Okay, D. A, B, C, D. There we go. All right.